Large parts of northeast Australia simply disappear under floodwaters in a disaster the scale of which hasn't been seen for decades. And it could get worse still. What's behind the devastating heavy rain? Is man to blame, or is it just heaven sent? This is Inside Story. Good to have you with us. Welcome to the programme. David Foster with you on this edition of Inside Story. A grim start of the year for the residents in northeast Australia. Battling some of the worst floods ever. Water levels still rising and the forecast for the next few days no better. More than 200,000 people in the state of Queensland have been affected. Andrew Thomas has this report from the ground.
The water stretches as far as the eye can see. Entire streets swamped by floodwater, with boats the only feasible way of moving around. Residents of Rockhampton, the regional hub, have been evacuating for days, and with flooding expected to peak later this week, many more are leaving their homes.
Police came along at about 3 o'clock and said, "You're out of here by 5. That's it, period.
Some will be hunkering down in temporary shelters for at least the next 10 days. The town now cut off. The airport closed, virtually all roads impassable. The city's mayor admitting the flooding is worse than originally thought and far from over yet.
This is a serious matter. We're still expecting that this potentially could be the second or third largest flood that this region has ever known.
Elsewhere, the floodwaters are receding, but any relief that brings is tempered by the devastation left behind. These yachts in Bundaberg were moored on dry land, but when the Burnett River rose by more than 6 metres in less than 12 hours, they were lifted, thrown, destroyed. The financial impact, pretty huge. These boats were worth millions. They're not anymore, and their insurance doesn't cover floods. Nearby, a residential caravan park, people's homes tossed around. The water's now gone, but there's still a sea of mud.
The water has gone down, but the trouble we have here is that all the dams on every tributary are actually full. So if we were to get another 200 millimetres of rain like we did on the night before the flood, things could turn nasty quite quickly.
50 families were living here, some now housed with relatives, others living under the awnings of those caravans that could be saved. Mosquito bites, the evidence of a sticky outdoor existence.
The morning it happened, they woke up to really the floodwaters being out their back door. So, and then from that we took them to somewhere safe just until then, and then we've had to come back here because we've got nowhere else to go really. So.
Overall, some 200,000 people in this region have been affected. The lucrative mining industry here badly hit. Crops, a major earner, left to rot. And with forecasts predicting more storms, the true cost of the damage to the Sunshine State only looks likely to rise. Andrew Thomas, Al Jazeera, Bundaberg, Australia.
Let's bring in our guest to talk about this subject from Kuala Lumpur, Faisal Parish, Director of the Global Environment Centre there. In Istanbul, Nuzet Dalfez, Professor Dalfez, the Director of Eurasia Institute of Earth Sciences at Istanbul Technical University. And from Doha, our very own meteorologist, Steph Galter. Welcome to you three. Also welcome to all of our viewers. Steph, let's go to you first of all. It's not just Australia that's suffering extreme weather. We're talking about the United States, Europe and other corners of the globe as well.
Well, yes, we are seeing extreme weather in many parts of the world, and some of it is linked. Now, most of us have heard of El Nino, but maybe not the lesser-known sister, La Nina. Now, on a year that's not El Nino or La Nina, this is what normally happens. Just due to the way that the Earth rotates, all the surface water of the Pacific heads towards the west. And what that means is towards the west is where the warmer surface waters go. So around Indonesia and Australia, here things will get very warm on the surface of the Pacific, but head down towards Peru, and here it will actually get pretty cold. Now, what happens during an El Nino year, the more famous of the two, is that the waters will wash back the other way. So we'll have these warmer waters near Peru. There'll be a temperature change here. But during the lesser-known sister, La Nina, this time the winds are stronger and they get pushed further towards the west. That's where the warmer waters go, but that means more of us are going to see these cooler waters. Now, frankly, you might be thinking, who cares? But it does actually affect the weather around the globe. For a start, in the northern parts of South America and through some parts of Central America, often here it's very, very wet, usually between June and August. And that's what we've seen this year. We saw widespread flooding in Venezuela and terrible flooding in Colombia as well that lasted nearly the entire year. And then further west, of course, we have now seen that flooding in Australia. And this was actually forecast because of La Nina. We expected intense rains, but of course not as bad as we've seen. So here, very, very wet between December and February. Now, other months that we've seen terrible flooding, if we go back in history, 1971 there in Bundaberg and also 1956. And interestingly, both of these years were also La Nina years.
Steph, what I'd like you to do is stay there and butt in when you think you've got something to say or you disagree with what our guests are saying. And let's go to Professor Dalfez first of all, in Istanbul. There is undoubtedly a changing climate, but the question is, does anybody doubt that it's man that's causing this, or could it be something else?
Well, one has to face the problem that the climate is the mixture of many, many things happening at the same time. So we have natural climate variability, which has been always there, even before man. And then there is the human impact on climate. So one thing I refrain from using is the term global warming, and I prefer the term global climate change. And global climate change will include both anthropogenic, so to speak, the human-induced climate change, and natural variability. And phenomena such as ENSO or North Atlantic Oscillation, they are part of the natural variability of the climate system. So when you face a particular event such as the one in northeastern Australia, it's very difficult to be able to say, okay, this is due to human impacts, or point your finger, so-called attribute this phenomena to human change, human-induced change in the climate of the Earth, or just natural phenomena. But what we know, what we are practically sure is that in the future, we will have more of these types of extreme events.
Faisal Parish, let me bring you in at this point. I'll come back to you, Professor, in just a moment. But Faisal, let me just ask you this. It's occurred to me sometimes that the reason we hear so much about climate change these days is because we're here, not just Al Jazeera, but mass communications, 24-hour news globally. Is it an entirely new phenomenon?
I think the climate and climate variability has been there, as Professor Dalfez says, for thousands of years. But what we're seeing in the last 20, 30, 40 years is an intensification of extreme events. Extreme events are becoming more frequent, and they're having a greater impact. Part of that is because there are more people in more vulnerable areas, but the number of events and the severity of events is increasing. And we believe from the scientific studies that this is linked to human-induced changes in the atmosphere, particularly the concentration of so-called greenhouse gases, which are leading to a gradual warming of the Earth. And the models are showing with this warming there becomes an intensification of some of the weather phenomenon that we're seeing around the world. And that, I think, is a contributing factor to the very frequent floods that we're now having. We've seen in Pakistan last year, we've seen in Malaysia and Southeast Asia in November and December, and now we're seeing in Queensland in Australia.
Faisal, let me interrupt you for a second. I have the benefit of being able to see all three of you at once, and I saw Steph Golter waving your hand, saying you'd like to say something. Do jump in.
All I was going to say, David, is that one thing I would say about the media's influence is it often isn't generally a good one. Like, there are lots of people who are quite sick of the term climate change, and they don't believe it. And there's lots of very sceptical people around these days. And sometimes I find the media doesn't altogether help.
Well, that's written yourself out of a job, Steph Golter. Thanks very much indeed. We'll keep you at least till the end of this programme. Professor Dalfez, let me come to you first. You say you don't like the term global warming. What about the term global cooling, which is being bandied around a bit at the moment?
Well, in some climate models for the next 20, 30 years in some regions, for example, the region of interest to me, region centered around Turkey, we do see decades of cooling also. But one thing which is sure, that the hydrological cycle, the intensity of the recycling of water in the atmosphere is going to be much more intense. That means that we will have stronger probability of facing events where we will have a larger amount of water pouring down in a shorter time period.
And
so
correct me if I'm wrong or right on this one, that also means that in colder climates you're going to get more snow.
Well, yes, for some regions, as it's been experienced in Western Europe and northern United States, northeastern United States, that's the case. That's true. So there are many aspects of it. I mean, some people are talking about changes in the meridional circulation in the North Atlantic, which can induce some drastic changes in the climate of northwestern Europe and northeastern United States. So many surprises might be waiting for us. So it's misleading to talk about just warming, because when you talk about warming, people are neglecting the all other aspects of human-induced climate change.
Yeah, Faisal Parish, let me ask you about this one. We're talking about climate change in general. The suggestion on an Australian website to do with the environment that I was looking at earlier on today, Australia, because of what's been happening there. One of the questions was, is it possible we could have a runaway effect and end up with an atmosphere like Venus because there's too much cloud cover and the sun can't get through?
Yeah, I think it'll take a while before we get to something like Venus, but there are in the current models and studies some speculation of so-called runaway warming, runaway emissions. And this is where we're looking at when the global carbon dioxide concentration goes to a certain level, that you may induce warming, and there you may get very large emissions from forest fires in forest. And in Southeast Asia, where I'm from, we have a very massive fires, peatland areas, which burn periodically, especially during El Nino events. And from this, one could say, land use or forest or natural sources, there could be very large emissions, which it is modeled or predicted could, in fact, become a potential runaway source of increased emission. The warmer it gets, the more fires, the more emission will come out, then the warmer it will get. So there is this model, but I don't think we're going to go to something like Venus in the near future unless we do anything more drastically wrong.
Steph, come back in.
Well, I would also say that we've already taken into account some of the cloud cover and things like that you were saying about the runaway atmospheres. And that's why there are differences with different models of how much warming there's going to be. So if there's, say, a lot of high cloud, that'll reflect all of the sun's rays back out into the atmosphere and the world will maybe get a bit cooler. But if there's a lot of low cloud, then perhaps that will keep us warm, because low cloud at night keeps us quite snug. So that's the reason why there are all the differences. Maybe we'll raise the atmosphere, the global climate by, say, a degree, and other people are saying 7 degrees. That's why, because we're already taking these little details into account, but we don't know exactly how much they're going to affect things yet.
Steph, I want to come back to you in just a moment, ask you to think about this while we're away. If there's anything in the last 10 years or so, in the time that you've been doing this, that has really surprised you. We'll come back to you for an answer on that weather-wise in just a moment. But Professor Dollfuss, CO2 emissions, there have been other times in history when they've been higher than they are now. What's happened then? Well, similar things happen at those times, and in the geologic past. We end up with a much warmer Earth with a much more active hydrological cycle. So those things happen, but of course they never end up in a situation where we have a runaway greenhouse effect. But let me point out that there are many possible feedbacks that are sort of scaring us, the climate scientists. One of them is the methane in the permafrost. So if we tend to warm up the Arctic latitudes, then there could be some more methane getting into the atmosphere, and that methane is a very intense, very strong greenhouse gas. So there are possibilities like that. Well, I mean, there are things that we know very well, and for that we can say easily that
human impacts on climate, it's a certainty, scientifically speaking. But there are also things that we don't know that much about, such as you know, how what's going to happen to glaciers and ice sheets and stuff like that. So sea level, the future of the sea level is an uncertain thing as far as I'm concerned.
Faisal Parish, how much of what we're seeing is perhaps down to natural phenomenon like volcanic eruptions, changing sunspots, you know, the amount of heat that can come from the sun, or all those sort of things? How much is not necessarily man-made?
Well, there is always a background of these natural phenomenon, but I think there have been a number of studies, and particularly those by IPCC, which have looked to strip out the natural phenomenon. You can average the temperature change over an 11-year cycle to remove the 11-year sunspot cycle. You can minimize the impact of the El Nino La Nina cycle with a 5-year average. But even if you look at these averages, then there is still a long-term trend over the last 150 years of steady global warming. And I think the natural phenomenon are there, but they can be eliminated from the system. You can see the underlying warming is there, which we believe is a human-induced warming.
I don't know whether you know Dr. Penny Wetton, who's from the Climate Impacts Group in Australia, but just let me just read you something that she wrote recently. Queensland in particular, where we've seen all of these floods, expect a warming of as much as 2 degrees by 2030 and 6 degrees by 2070, unless things change. So I'm going to ask you, how much of what we're seeing at places like Copenhagen, the climate change conference there, and Cancun most recently, how much of this is actually going to help?
How much is what's going to happen at the climate negotiations? Well, I mean, some are saying too little, too late, but I think we have to make progress. I mean, there has been some little progress at Cancun, and we hope that this will be solidified in the next year or two. But I think we can't wait till the global negotiations are over. Everyone, every country, every industry has to start making changes now. And it's possible to move to a low carbon emission future. And it's possible to continue to make money and maintain the economies and so on, but having less emissions. And I think that's where everyone has to go, and everyone can make the change now. You don't have to wait till the future is known, till the negotiations are complete. Everyone can start doing their bit to contribute to reduction of emissions.
And as a non-expert, would it be idiotic of me to suggest that an example of how we can make changes is the hole in the ozone layer, which has closed a little bit because of changes we've made to chlorofluorocarbons and things like that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good example where through an agreed process, everyone in the world simultaneously started taking action, and there was some repair to the system. The change to the climate is not going to be so simple. It's a much bigger, more complex system. But I think if we have a window up until in the next 5 and 10 years, if we can really make some very strong progress in reducing the rate of emissions and bringing down the emissions, stopping the growth, then there is a hope that we can at least slow down. We will not be able to totally halt the change. The hope is to keep it to a maximum of 1.5 degrees, or at worst case at 2 degrees increase. With that, it is felt that can be manageable. The difference between 1.5 to 2 degrees, some countries will disappear. Pacific Island countries and coastal areas will be severely affected. If in the very, very bad case it goes to 3 or 4 degrees, then we're all in very deep trouble. And that will affect all of us around the planet, both for our life and welfare, but also the economies around the world will be very severely affected by floods, droughts, major events, as we're seeing now.
Yeah, in deep trouble, quite literally, I'm sure, too. Professor Dalfus, it's only really been headline news for, the last 10 years? How long before that did some people start to warn that we were damaging our world, perhaps beyond repair?
Well, that's something very, very difficult to say. I mean, I hate to deal with numbers which we are uncertain about. But I'm usually not very much of optimist as far as the human decisiveness about cutting down the emissions. So when I talk about these issues, I always say that this medallion has two faces. One of them is mitigation. Of course, we have to do everything possible to cut down the emissions and prevent disastrous future. But at the same time, in the meantime, I should say, the CO2 levels and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will keep increasing, and we will face a climate change. So adaptation is the other aspect of climate change. And if we, that's what I'm trying to do with my research group, is that if we have better information about what's going to be the future of the climate in a given region, then we can provide a sort of a basic input to a process that will lead to adaptation of many aspects of human life, such as water resource management or agriculture, or disaster preparedness, such as the case with floods, you know.
I'm going to come back to both of you in just a
word.
second for a final summation, and I'd like you to think about what you believe at the moment are the most important advances being made in pushing back the damage we're doing. But Steph Galty, you've had a couple of minutes to think about the weather patterns that have surprised you in the last 10 years.
More than the weather patterns that have surprised me over the last 10 years or so, I would say it's the human aspect of it that surprised me as well. We've always had big storms, and now perhaps they're reported more, so we see more of them, as well as there actually being more disasters as well. But it's often afterwards that you begin to hear about what accentuated the problems, and often it's things like they diverted a lot of the water away so that they could use the water, and then they built on the floodplains, or they built on the floodplains because there weren't enough room for houses elsewhere. Even in the UK we're doing that. It doesn't have to be a developing country. So that's something that always surprises me, that often there's a human element that will accentuate the natural disasters to really not help them at all.
Thanks, Steph. Faisal Parish, quick thought from you before we say goodbye. What are the most important advances being made at the moment?
I think it's a recognition that there is a serious problem out there and that we need to tackle it on two fronts, on reducing the emissions and also preparing for a warmer climate, a more unpredictable climate with more extreme events. And in Southeast Asia, for example...
It's got to be very short. I'm so sorry. We get your point. Professor Delfas, is anybody doing anything that's worthwhile?
Well, unfortunately, the process is, as far as I'm concerned, too slow. So both on the aspect of mitigation and also adaptation. What sort of makes life difficult is this natural variability of the system. Some years we have drought, some years we have floods, and then people have a hard time perceiving the danger as it is. People have a hard time to cope with variability and feel in their bones, so to speak, that this is an imminent problem.
Thank you. If the end of the world is not nigh, then the end of this programme is certainly upon us. Thank you very much, all three of you, for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Write to us, if you like, Inside Story at AlJazeera.net. From me, David Foster, for now, goodbye.